Tēnā mai, haere mai, ki ngā pūrongo o te Ono Karaka. Welcome to One News Tonight. There's been tears, anger and calls to never let it happen again. After more than 6 years and more than 2,000 survivor testimonies, the final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care has been released. Set up to investigate historical abuse, the inquiry heard testimonies that ultimately spanned 7 decades. The report estimating that of the 655,000 people in care during that time, 200,000, almost a third, were abused. Even more, neglected. Noting with many records not kept or destroyed, the true figure can't be known. That abuse carries a cost, about $857,000 over a survivor's lifetime. That's based on the loss of everyday activities New Zealanders consider normal. The total bill reaching up to $217 billion. In the final report, there are 138 recommendations. The immediate priority, to get the compensation scheme up and running and consider making it compulsory for care providers. It also calls for a number of apologies, including a government apology from the Prime Minister and apologies from religious leaders, including the Pope, for the abuse and neglect that occurred here under the Catholic Church. We have comprehensive coverage tonight with our team standing by. First, Kushla Norman was with survivors as the findings were tabled.
They wouldn't have missed today for the world.
Long journey, sister. We got here.
Tony Jarvis and Kath Costa, two of the many survivors of state care abuse, present for the Crown's Day of Reckoning.
This is part of history, and it's a bad part of history, and it's still continuing.
For decades, they told us we made it up. They wouldn't have a bar of us, so this today is historic.
This little light of mine.
The sun out, their song uplifting as they walk to the heart of power, carrying ribbons. For the price of a fully funded failure, evident in Tony and Kath's testimony.
I was sexually abused at least 6 times when I went to the toilets to urinate.
He was out the gate, you know, like tied you up, did whatever he wanted to do with you. And how did I cope with it? I just switched off.
New Zealand once promoted itself as a bastion of human rights, but behind the neat grounds, abuse was happening everywhere the inquiry looked. At Lake Alice, electric shock treatment was used as punishment.
The Crown tried to deny it and they covered up with Crown law, spent millions of taxpayers' money trying to hush us, but the truth always prevails.
And finally, the truth's been tabled. 14 kilograms of harrowing accounts and sweeping calls for change. The magnitude of it all absorbed by survivors from the public gallery.
Many of your stories are horrific and harrowing. They are painful to read, but not nearly as painful as they were to endure.
The Prime Minister will make a formal apology in November, but one was made today.
Today I stand humbly before you in this House to offer a long overdue apology to the survivors of Lake Alice. I am sorry that it has taken so long for this acknowledgement of torture.
It was the party opposite that ordered the inquiry, but it didn't implement the interim recommendations to start a redress scheme.
But Prime Minister, we didn't do enough. And the ball now falls to you and your government. This must be bigger than politics.
The Prime Minister says cost isn't a barrier.
We're going to do it right. It's important that we address this up and we do the very best that we can around redress. It's not about the dollars.
The final report calls for an overhaul of the care system based on 12 principles. Those principles would inform a new national strategy carried out by a new agency with an independent board, all legislated under a new Care Safety Act. The recommendations warn an apology is hollow without change.
Going to bring in Kushla now. Kushla, an extremely emotional day, and more of those ribbons being displayed tonight.
That's right, Melissa. I'm outside a Catholic church near Parliament. The fence is starting to fill up with some of these ribbons. They symbolise survivors who have not made it to this day. Now, of course, the church and faith-based institutions were included in the inquiry. Now, survivors expect that this fence will fill up with ribbons over the course of the coming night and days. I understand that survivors have come down from as far as Auckland just to tie a ribbon here, and that ribbons are being sent over from survivors in Australia too.
Ngā mihi nui. Thank you very much, Kushla. And sexual abuse was experienced by a higher proportion of those in faith-based care than in state care. The inquiry found it led to the breakdown of many families where the experiences of survivors weren't believed. Brian Boswell reports.
Seen by many as a safe haven close to God, the Catholic Church is being demonised for decades of abuse.
This abuse is our country's shame.
From the age of 5, Francis Tangaloa suffered sexual and emotional abuse at the hands of a Catholic brother.
I came forward as a faith-based survivor to tell my story because I did not want this abuse to happen to anyone else.
The Royal Commission finding the highest levels of sexual abuse were reported at Catholic institutions, as well as at Dilworth School in Auckland and Maryland School in Christchurch.
There'll be people who don't want to believe it, and so that you know, and they'll open the paper and then they'll just turn the page over because they don't want to read. They don't want to read about the rape and torture of children.
The moral authority of religious leaders allowed abusers in faith-based institutions to offend with impunity, according to the report. Religious beliefs were often used to justify their actions and to silence survivors.
Unless you are on the ground in Gloriavale, you have family and their friends or people like us who are involved in supporting people, I dare to say the government and ministries haven't got a clue.
Now faith-based leaders, including the Pope, are being asked to apologise for the abuse.
Not one thing will suit everybody.
It's being recommended all faith-based agencies work closely with the proposed CareSafe agency and independent oversight bodies to ensure suggested standards, accreditation and vetting is implemented for all those working with children.
You can have a sports organisation that's dangerous to children because they don't have an adequate child protection policy, no one knows it.
The inquiry wants all religious leaders trained to tackle abuse and neglect, and for any convicted of such a crime to be removed.
We actually need to see some action.
Avoiding more stories like hers stacking up remains up to the state. Ryan Boswell, One News.
The reports found disabled survivors suffered higher levels of all forms of abuse than those who were non-disabled. It points to discrimination, which saw those with disabilities segregated from society and placed permanently in institutional care from a young age. This survivor lived in that setting for 45 years. The report calls for an attitude change, which would help stop people being placed in group homes or supported living and never leaving.
We need better support provider so that residential care shouldn't be needed going forward.
He says if the report findings don't galvanise New Zealand into making change for the disabled community, nothing will. Māori children made up the majority of those in state care, with the inquiry finding they were also more likely to be sent to harsher institutions. Māori and Pacific survivors also endured higher levels of physical abuse, breaching the Treaty of Waitangi and giving rise to gang membership. Political editor Mikey Sherman reports.
The rise of gangs in New Zealand between the 1950s and 1980s can be traced back to state care abuse, which many survivors say was a pipeline to prison.
When I went into the prison the first time, I'd never been there before. But we get into the yards and 80% of the people, it's because we all grew up together and we were brought up together in state care.
Rawiri Waretini Karena isn't a gang member, but having entered state care at the age of 5, by 17 he was convicted of murder.
I take full responsibility of my actions, but There were things that happened in state care which also contributed to the environment that I was brought up in.
The Commission found between the 1950s and 80s, Māori experienced heightened state surveillance and targeting by New Zealand Police and other government agencies.
We are determined that gangs cannot peddle harm and suffering on their fellow citizens. We will continue to work with making sure that they have an opportunity to turn their lives around through rehabilitation.
Māori children are still overrepresented in care today.
I believe that 67% of young people in care are Māori.
Ihorangi Reweti Peters came out of state care in October.
Abuse did not stop at 1999. It is still happening.
Is there work that needs to be done? Yes. And I've set those expectations.
The Minister says greater devolution to community is the solution, but with continued state oversight.
I think it's actually disgusting that my job does have to exist.
Erica Stanford spoke of the young unwed pregnant mothers in care.
That were deliberately underfed because they wanted to have easy births and small babies. And then they drugged them up and they took their babies. They never got to hold them. That is confronting.
Stripped of their culture and care, Māori have intergenerational scars.
It disconnects you from your language, from your culture, from your heritage. It disconnects you from the land of the whenua.
Rawiri now holds a PhD and works as a tertiary lecturer, a rare triumph in a tale of sorrow.
We'll bring in Mikey now. Kia ora, Mikey. A damning final report. What happens now?
Tēnā rā tātou katoa I tēnei, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Well, there are now two parts to this. One are the recommendations, of which there are 138 for the government to consider and to implement. And two is the redress, which is essentially the issue of compensation for survivors. We have had figures in the billions of dollars thrown around in terms of that, but today the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, he wouldn't give an estimate as to what he thought this may cost the government, saying that a lot of work needs to go into that. They will have an update though in November to coincide with the government's formal apology to survivors. He said that in terms of redress though, that will be the priority. That was the call from the Royal Commission of Inquiry. Christopher Luxon also wants to see bipartisan support across the House from all political parties when it comes to redress and the recommendation, saying this is not about politics, it is about New Zealand as a nation trying its best to make it right by the survivors. Now remember, all of this is new terrain. This is the first inquiry of its scale and size in the history of our country, so it is something that the government will be grappling with for the first time. We certainly felt the sense of the day, of the occasion in the House of Parliament. All MPs gave speeches from the heart. We had tears, and there was a real genuine desire to make it right.
Tēnei te mihi atu. Thank you very much, Mikey.